how that is funded?
Well, Bill, thanks for the question. We're a modular organisation, so we have unlimited demand on one supply, and when we raise money, we do it by cocktail parties, by family and friends. We have some regular donors, and we have some DFAT funding. And we spend about $700,000 a year cash. We receive about $1 million plus in donated time from medical specialists, and we receive about $1.5 million of medical equipment. So our overall budget in RDA terms is about $3 million, but only a quarter of that's cash.
Thank you, Graham. There is perhaps time for one more question on over there.
Hi there, just a question with the representative for AMAC. One of the challenges faced by international mining companies to move into the African region is to navigate the compliance requirements for each of the regions. I just wanted to know how AMAC could assist in that area, or if this kind of information should be really assisted from the government level.
I think, I wish there was an easy answer on that. I think the easiest way for us to facilitate those conversations is through our networks and our networks of networks. And it's important having someone on the ground locally that understands what the requirements are. It's a very interesting dynamic when you are dealing in a jurisdiction like Australia, for example. You may have a list of 20 things that you need to be compliant on, right? And you go through those 20 things and everything works, and sure, there's a process, it takes time, you get through it, and you'll get the outcome you're chasing. A lot of the countries in Africa will have 20 things, but there are only 3 of the 20 that are important. And the key is understanding which 3 you need to get done, what needs to be done when, and when they need to be done. And the others will happen over time, but it doesn't follow the same potential process that you have in Australia. So I can't stress enough how important local understanding is, someone local on the ground, and leveraging local knowledge. You can't do better than that. And I think going back to one of the areas we try to keep increasing and actively building are the local understanding, local content connections, and trying to make sure that we bridge or act as a bridge between the company and those local people around, or local experts around what it is they're trying to achieve. I'm not sure I'm getting the exact answer you might be looking for. You can't do it here by yourself without a local partner or without someone local understanding what is required on the ground. It's just never going to work.
Thank you very much. I think we'll bring the session to a close. I'd ask if we might just offer a round of applause for the 3 speakers. Thank you very much. And now I'll ask Dominic to come up and take the panel.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to our speakers. Incredibly diverse final session. It was really enjoyable. Thank you. I might now ask our panelists to come up and join me for this last session of Africa Down Under 2025. So Mzila and Charles and Keith, you're more than welcome to come up and join me now. Please don't leave me alone. For the sake of every delegate here who's heard me get up and down on this stage this week, I need your support where I can. My name is Dominic Piper. I'm the editor of Paydirt and Gold Mining Journal, and your moderator for this final session, final panel discussion of the conference. We will have closing drinks soon after, and lunch after we finish here. So Bill has asked me to set a test for everybody who wants to drink a glass of wine or a beer outside will have to pass a test based on the content of this final session. So anybody who's outside and waiting for the drinks to come out, you're going to have to come back and come in here to qualify for at least one drink. Anyway, let's move on. Final session, as you can see, we're focused on the critical minerals conundrum. And we decided to put this session together on the back of last year's discussions and fortunately on the back of this year's discussions as well, where critical minerals, despite market movements, maybe not the flavour of the month they quite were 18 or 24 months ago, and I'm sure Keith will have some opinions on that, as well as Charles. But it's still a crucial debate, both in African mining development, but also here in Australia, in every aspect around the development of upstream projects, the ability for downstream value addition in the sector, and also the geopolitical dimensions of the critical mineral space, from everything from offtake to funding to government policy. So I've asked three esteemed guests to join us here. I think we've met we've only met Mzila before. We're fortunate to have Charles and Keith on there. Mzila Mthenjane, CEO of the Minerals Council of South Africa. Thank you, Mzila, for joining us. Charles Altshuler, CFO of Globe Metals and Mining. Thank you, Charles. Niobium developer in Malawi. And Keith Muller, CEO of Atlantic Lithium, lithium developer in Ghana, and new owner of a mining license, I believe. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Really, as I mentioned, critical minerals and particularly the downstream element of the sector have been a huge debate over the last couple of years. But there's a few assumptions that I feel have been built in to the sector that I want to try and pursue and see if they stand up to scrutiny. There's an assumption held in Africa, but here in Australia as well, that if you've got the minerals, whether it's lithium or niobium or rare earths or nickel for that matter, you should be able to produce the end battery products that go into EVs or to the defence industries or whatever it may be. For the miners, this is a challenge because they've never traditionally been good downstream processes. They've left it to other industries. But there's a big gap in the sector. And then complicating it further is the geopolitical dimension of the West. And other major economies try to diversify and de-risk their supply chains outside of China. So, I mean, quite a light subject for us to take on in the final session. Mzila, I want to start with you. I sent you a couple of questions this morning, but I'm going to start with a slightly different one because I know how adept you are. We've had this conversation before at this conference and others, but I think it's worth pursuing again. What defines a critical mineral in the in the context of African mining? Here in Australia, we know we have a critical minerals list, but as African governments, and South Africa in particular, have put together their critical minerals list, they look very different at times to what Australia or the US or Canada or Japan would have. Is this conversation, are we talking about the same critical minerals?
Thanks for that question, Dom. And I think it is a very important question to start off with because we, as the Minerals Council of South Africa, also played some role in the development of South Africa's critical minerals strategy. And the word strategy, I think, should be just understood very carefully and cautiously. And one of the key drivers was the fact that, okay, there's an acknowledgement that there's no universal definition of critical minerals. Secondly, when you look at where a lot of the definitions and the list of critical minerals were coming from, it's what I guess you could refer to as the global north, America, UK, Europe, Australia, and so on. And I think given this huge expected demand and how the definition came about, that it was from those countries that actually needed these critical minerals for an economic plan that they had, or whether that economy was driven by military supremacy or technology or whatever the case is. And so I think what then evolved is from a supply perspective. So that would be the demand side, as I saw it. And from a supply perspective, which then meant that it was predominantly African and South America and some of the Asian countries, it was more of a reaction rather than, in my view, a considered response. And so when South Africa developed its strategy, or its list, it was more from the role that these minerals play currently in the economy, and largely from a social perspective in terms of employment, contribution to GDP, exports, and so on and so forth. But from an economic strategy perspective, I think it's still lacking that strategy in terms of how do we actually play a role in meeting the demand side, whilst from a supply perspective, we still get the benefit, economically or otherwise, that comes from those minerals. So there's this gap that has been created, in my mind, between the countries that need the minerals and the countries that have the minerals, in as far as what is going to be the mutual benefit from those. I think the minerals are pretty much common between both, those countries that need them and those that have them. But just given the huge interest and attention to Africa, it has resulted in a response from the African continent where it's about how do we get the most as quickly as possible from this emergent demand. But I think that reaction is lacking in strategy in terms of how do we sustainably make sure that we reduce the supply risk gap, but also get the benefit in terms of development of the continent. So it's defined largely on, I think, short-term perspective.
Thanks, Mzila. Keith, is it a similar experience in Ghana? I mean, Ghana, as Mzila says, from a demand perspective, Ghana doesn't need lithium for domestic production. Have you seen a development around lithium as a critical mineral in the policy space in Ghana?
Well, it was interesting what you mentioned about the expectations that certain central governments have. We've been operating in Ghana since 2016, and when we published our MRE in 2023, I remember the next day I was in Ghana when this occurred. The daily newspaper had Ghana to become the next critical hub for electric vehicles. And lithium as such, in a typical Tesla battery that you see, about 2 to 2.5% of the weight of that battery is actually lithium, right? So to go from such a small compartment of what makes up electric vehicle to we are going to be the hub of electric vehicles, there's a lot of gaps in education. So certainly when we started off in Ghana, the expectation was that there's going to be all this notion around downstream processing. But I think when it comes to policy on critical minerals, however you might define critical minerals, is as an investor and operator in Africa, what we more want to see than a policy is we want to see what long-term strategy looks like. And long-term strategy across the entire value chain from exploration to processing and to further manufacturing. Because what is one of the things that you fear as an investor is you fear the rules changing on you last minute. So being able to predict what the outcomes are going to be, when it comes to policy, and often what policy does is it's short-sighted and it's looking at immediate gains. And the fear in Africa is nationalization, right? So how much of our tenement are we going to be left with at the end of this? And all of that is fine. And, whether the government wants a stake of 20%, 30%, 5%, it doesn't matter. It all just becomes part of the cost base, right? So when you enter into the exploration phase, and as you go through stage gates and you spend more money in country, all of that is what you build into your economic model, right? It's a cost of doing business in country. But it's the unpredictability that makes it very hard for us. And I think that's one of the good things we've seen in Ghana is certainly things has been slow, but it's been predictable. So that's one of the benefits that we enjoy much out of Ghana.
Thanks, Keith. Charles, in Malawi, lithium is almost simple compared with the market for niobium and the uses for niobium. It's an emerging commodity and one that even the most sophisticated of resources industry investors isn't really familiar with. How is your process of talking and working with government gone to express the notion of it being a critical mineral and should therefore be treated slightly differently, or should it be treated slightly differently?
Yeah, certainly it's definitely treated differently. What we have to educate the government and the market on is the fact that niobium is something you can't just sell concentrate to China, for example. You need to beneficiate it to an oxide level, even to metals in some cases. So as Globe Metals and Mining, we will be beneficiating it in country to oxide. And this means when we want to sell our story, it's about showing test work, metallurgical results. It's all about the impurities. We will produce 99.99% niobium and tantalum oxide. So what are the impurities? What are the specifications of the product? If it's going into the battery space, it's about the the stability of the product into that space. So it becomes a very technical conversation versus something like gold or copper, which is just kind of it's relatively standard. And niobium is very specialized, and that is also why niobium is like the US just released their top 50 critical metals. Niobium is number 10. And it's about the source of supply. The 90% comes from Brazil, and it's about the uses. They show that if there's a supply shortage, the US government will lose about $100 billion in GDP because it's used in defense, it's used in MRI machines, specialty alloys. So because it's so specialized, you have to, you have to produce it to certain levels. You have to have good quality control. So also when you're talking to government, you need those specialized skills, and you have to show investors and government that information.
And what's you're talking about investors there? We've seen a lot of mineral trends down the years, especially at this conference. We've seen different commodities come and go in the sort of in the popularity, but many have been frustrated. Development of many of these minerals have been frustrated because of a lack of certain characteristics in the African space, whether for iron ore it's a lack of infrastructure, railway and port, or a lack of power for processing and so forth. Where are the gaps? Mzila, you might want to start. Where are the gaps in that critical mineral space in some of these more advanced projects that need to be filled before African countries can take advantage of these demands?
I think picking up from what Charles has just contributed, first and foremost, in the point that I made, it's that economic strategy. And I think the example he gave of niobium and the US in terms of where it fits in the economy and the value at risk if they don't get sufficient and reliable supply is a very good example in terms of when any African country speaks of beneficiation, it must have with a clear outlook to the market that it's going to supply, whether it's domestic, particularly if it's going to be domestic, or if it's going to be offshore. And then it must then be a case of, well, it's not going to be all metals or all minerals that can then be beneficiated, because each mineral will need to be beneficiated, as the expression goes in South Africa, to different degrees, depending on capabilities. And this comes to your question then, that I think we've seen a lot of governments speak of value add, but the fundamentals are not there. I mean, and I'll once again give an example of South Africa where, in actual fact, South Africa has been value adding for a long time. You look at steel, we have iron ore, and we have steel, we have manganese, we have all the input components for steel manufacturing, ferrochrome, ferromanganese, even go as far as platinum into autocatalysts. And because of the challenges that we've been experiencing with electricity for the past 15 years, other markets have overtaken us. China has overtaken us in terms of ferrochrome production. And so unless, and this is where the whole holistic strategy is required in terms of, if the outlook is to be able to firstly provide certain products to a particular market, we need to work back to what are the key enablers that we need to have in place on a reliable basis, but also affordable for cost competitiveness, such that when the product lands on your customer's door, it lands in a manner that is affordable to that customer. So there's some of those missing basics that I don't think governments are giving sufficient consideration for. Logistics, get the product to market, because that is not only a challenge to get the product offshore, but also in country as well, to the extent that you don't have appropriate and sufficient road infrastructure, water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure. It's going to be a challenge to get that product to where you need it. And this is perhaps more of an opportunity for the continent and the different regions of the continent in terms of a regional strategy of how they can maximize the benefits from minerals in terms of looking at how you can build regional markets for domestic use. So domestic is no longer just the one country, but the region. And then using infrastructure to be able to catalyze that industrialization.
Keith, listen, Mzila, it strikes me that here in Australia, we're the largest lithium producer in the world. We're still struggling with the concept of becoming a value addition industry in the lithium space. We've failed so far. The one lithium hydroxide facility that has been built and is, well, it's sort of running, it's still not reached commercial capacity after more than 2 years. The second one has just started producing in the last couple of months, but it's still, the jury is still out on that one. This isn't a problem that is just faced by African countries, is it?
No, not at all. And I want to pick up on what Charles said about the US and the China race for critical minerals, and then what was mentioned on infrastructure. So, what is the battleground? Why are we all fighting over the same thing? And the battleground is feedstock, right? It is, how do we secure the feedstock? Because those who control the feedstock will control the future of the battery minerals, right? So if you do not have that critical mass in feedstock, and this is one of the things that Australia did well, is they build up a massive supply of feedstock first before they went into downstream processing. And I think this is one of the things that African governments often get wrong, is they think you can run before you walk. Right, so let's build a big base of feedstock, because it is that critical mass in feedstock that's going to attract investment for further upstream processing, or downstream processing for that matter. So certainly what we are seeing all over the African continent is that there's that short-term desire for value addition. So we use the term value addition, and wouldn't it make sense if it adds value? Wouldn't we all just jump at it? Why are we having this debate? If it's real value addition, let's just do it. It's understanding whether it's value addition or whether it's perceived or masked as value addition. Now, job creation is something different than value addition, but let's say that, because that's something else.
Yeah.
But it's also worth mentioning, Dominic, that mining is a very different and distinctly different industry and business activity to processing and beneficiation, at least beyond, processing on site. It has, beyond just the input of the mineral, it has other very different inputs. And so this is where the challenge starts in terms of expecting those who produce the mineral to naturally invest in the downstream, because as a miner, we're not built that way. We're built to extract and to reduce from a processing perspective, and then we give it to the next person to do with it what needs to be done. And this is where I think there needs to be an understanding in terms of what are the policy requirements for exploration, importantly, and then mining, where you have to translate prospecting into mining, and what are the requirements when you want to beneficiate. And each one of these has different requirements from a policy perspective. But the one fundamental principle that is consistent is that policy certainty over a long period of time, because each one of them, especially from a mining and benefit, requires a huge amount of capital, and they have different return profiles, and they'll therefore attract different investor profiles.
Yeah, Charles, I mean, Globe has experienced this in real time, essentially trying to build a project that has different elements of beneficiation and value addition. Concentrate, how far do we go? Can you talk us through your findings as a company about how you end up with a product that is both achievable but marketable?
Absolutely. So the process we went through is about kind of securing off-takes first. And making sure what we do links to what's required, what the need is. We started our initial feasibility study back in 2013, showed us going to full scale. Then as the years went by, we reduced the scale. And now in the last few years, we need to increase the scale from the original full scale even higher because of the demand and the demand for the off-takes that we have. And so we kind of, we do that top-down approach where you looked at the demand and then you based what you got to produce and the specifications on that basis. And in terms of, funding the project, it's for example, the RDC in South Africa, the Industrial Development Corporation, are investing $10 million in our project. And it's not just about the margin, because the margin is right now $60,000 per ton for niobium oxide, and it costs us about $15,000. So the margin is significant. It's also about that they have a first right of refusal to acquire niobium oxide for the South African government if they do wish so. So it's also about funding of niobium, as an example, is not just about the normal, profitability. It's also about securing critical metals for companies or for countries. Some of the conversations I've had with off-takers is they don't mind if they stockpile, they buy it from us and they stockpile for years. I mean, I'm a trained accountant, and most important is about cash flow. In which accounting principles do you not, even like a trader, do you buy it and then stockpile it? It just doesn't make sense. But now the world's changing. Critical metals, they're okay to stockpile. So I've seen a total change in how we market the product, in how we get funding. Yeah, a lot has changed in the last few years.
Funding, a lot has changed, and funding in particular. We had a conversation on stage yesterday about alternative funding models, development finance, institution finance, export credit finance, and in the critical mineral space, it becomes even more complicated. We've heard a lot over the last 5 years about, and we've mentioned it on this stage, about the US and the EU, the UK, Australia even, looking to Africa to support their critical mineral ambitions. Are we actually seeing that on the ground? Keith, are you recognising a change in interest and in focus on Africa?
Yeah, our funding philosophy has changed over the last couple of years. We were initially largely focused on offtake financing or credit financing as such. But with the downturn in our commodities specifically, the long-term need and the unpredictability out of the African continent, it's hard to match someone putting a large amount of funds into a project today for something that you will deliver in 3 or 4 years if there's any uncertainty on what might happen in that 4 years. So I think it's both the downturn in the commodity cycle linked up with uncertainty, and especially what we're seeing in many West African jurisdictions at the moment, where juntas are running the country, where the government stake is changing on a consistent basis. Those things together makes it very challenging to secure funding long term. So we have turned to more conventional project financing as a result of the combination of uncertainty and as well as the downturn.
Thanks. Well, I've done enough work for a little bit. I think it's time for our audience to put in a little bit of effort for me. Have we got any questions from the floor? I knew Mr. Turner would not let me down.
Yeah, look, a comment more than anything. It seems to me for the last 30 or 40 years, with this global economy or global trading and opening up of markets all around the world, there's been an extraordinary focus on the cost, with very little focus on political issues. That's led us to a situation where some countries that have all this downstream processing capability have enormous political leverage as a result of controlling where their products might be sold and whether or not they might be sold. And my feeling is we haven't balanced the political issues with the economic interests, or the economic interests, as much as we should have. And we should have a more diversified downstream processing route, where if something falls over, it's backed up by a facility in another country. And when I look at the south, you look at all this production from Australia, lithium and so on, so much of it goes to China. Why can't it go to some other Southeast Asian country where it might be, the cost of doing that downstream processing would be a lot less perhaps than doing it in Australia, where the labour costs are much higher here, let's say, and that influences, the cost of the final product. Why haven't we used that balance of commercial interest and political interest to spread where our downstream processing takes place? Yeah. And places like Indonesia, why haven't we had much more political and commercial engagement with a country like that? Which I think we should have.
Yeah.
And other countries in Southeast Asia as well.
But I think this is the point I was trying to make as well earlier. This is where the opportunity lies for Africa and different regions of Africa, where there can be a consolidation on areas where there's a comparative advantage in terms of certain commodities. And it's going to require that politicians take a step back and look at the region and how looking at it from a regional perspective gives them that competitive advantage. One of the things about South Africa's critical minerals list that for me was outstanding was we're trying to position ourselves to be a diversified source of supply. Recognizing the scramble on the demand side. And I think at the moment what seems to be a little bit of a chaos on the supply side. I think a better organized supply side can actually take huge advantage of the current geopolitics and gain advantage for that region in terms of certain minerals.
Yeah, a point I was going to ask you, Charles, is this current state of flux and uncertainty, does that, despite commodity prices going up and down, does it actually open more avenues up for potential offtake and funding and so on?
Yeah, it's certainly opening more opportunities, because now it's more about strategic investors versus just institutional or just normal commodity investors, because it's about countries and companies securing critical metals and thereby investing in your project, not just because of the financial aspects. So I think, per your statement, it's a bit more, countries and companies are considering not just the cash flows, but also, and not just the cost, but also just the concept of securing critical metals, even if it is at a higher cost.
And I guess if you look at the point you make around China, we all understand that China has 50-year strategies, whereas most of us look at 10-year strategies. And at best, if we look at a 30-year mine life, we'll focus on the period towards it reaches peak, which will maybe be about 10 to 15 years. And then we assume that it will stay the same. So I often say to myself, just to maintain my sanity, yes, okay, I was caught sleeping by the Chinese, right? And that's not going to change very easily, despite the desire for beneficiation in South Africa. So we have to deal with the reality as it's presented to us. And so, and we in a totally different game where the manner in which China provides financing for projects is not in exactly the same way as the rest of the Western world does. It's combined finance between government and business, and you can't see the difference. And so the cost of capital is reduced, and you can't compete on that basis. So there are different models that have come up, and we need to look at, we're going to have to be a lot more innovative in terms of how in country and within regions, from a supply side, we work together to gain some advantage. But we're certainly not going to be in a position where we're going to be able to beat the current competitors.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting situation, isn't it? For most of the last 50 years, the mining sector would request a laissez-faire approach to their commerciality and their marketing and say, please, government, stay out of our way. We know what we're doing. Now, with the global geopolitical situation as it is, they're perhaps saying, well, actually, no, we're going to need your help we need to work in partnership to ensure that we carve out, and whether that's the supplying nation or the consuming nation, to carve out a supply chain for us. Thank you, Bill. Have we got any other questions? We've got a few minutes left. We're going to have to pull up the stumps a little bit early on our clock down here. Thank you, Doug. Yep.
Can you hear me? There
Yes.
we go. And through this conference and certainly other conferences, China comes up regularly, no doubt. And I don't think that landscape is going to shift anytime soon. The interesting one for me, stepping back and looking at the continent and where funds are flowing in from, is the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. A conversation with one of our members about 3 weeks ago, and he'd been asked to attend a meeting with a group in Saudi, and this one institution, family office, whatever you want to call them, have $380 billion for Africa projects to secure mineral resources. I'm almost concerned that from an Africa perspective, and how even if we pull together a southern central region, how do you compete with that in terms of building the capacity to refine those sorts of strategic minerals and those critical minerals? Because, again, I think in terms of the comment around we were asleep at the wheel with China, Saudi is doing exactly the same thing. And they might not have the expertise and the experience, but they have the power to buy that. And it's happening so fast. So, again, a comment, probably not a question, but how do we not lose out again, right? I don't know.
I think one of the commonalities between the two examples you're drawing between China and the Middle East, specifically Saudi Arabia, is it's that long-term vision, right? It's not a 10-year strategy. This is a lifetime. This is generational wealth that they're trying to change. You know, particularly Saudi with Vision 2035, where they want to change a large proportion of the GDP over from oil into other critical mineral spaces, and actually, you know, any extractive minerals it's a long-term vision. So that's what we got to do in Africa to be competitive, is to have a very long-term vision on what we want to achieve.
Yeah. And if I can contribute as well, my experience of Saudi so far and my interactions has that they're actually trying to adopt a different model, where they're actually seeking out mutuality and wanting to build capacity on the African side, and not just extract raw materials and then import. I think, and so they're taking a long-term vision, not just in terms of their own economic strategy, but I think also from an African perspective, in terms of as Saudi diversifies its economy and enables the mining of these minerals, what is it that it also provides on a sustainable basis in those countries? And what I'm hoping will happen is that should put more pressure on African leaders to begin to also think long-term. Because one of their frustrations in working in Africa is the pace of response. And in response, I think also not also seeing a coordinated response and a long-term response. So I think and I think this is something that I'm also seeing as well in terms of the huge focus on ESG, as well as many other factors. For instance, we've come out of 2024 when there were more than 75 countries voting, and this has sent a huge message politically to government in terms of a need for change. And the people who are participating or who are not participating were youth. And so the combination of factors, I think, is coming together to really drive the message that I think there's a need for different behavior and conduct on the part of our African politicians in terms of really thinking long-term for the benefit of the people, not just over the political term. And so the role that mining, I think, has in Africa is probably going to be first and foremost not necessarily seeing the kind of beneficiation of value addition that is so much desired, but it's going to, how can mining be used to really begin to put in place the basics? And from a Minerals Council perspective, we partnered with an entity in the UK called AFIDA, where we're looking at the concept of mining-enabled infrastructure, such that you're able to provide for water infrastructure. Mining in South Africa is the biggest investor in renewable energy. Mining in South Africa is actually playing a huge role in refurbishing and working with Transnet in terms of the railways. So get those basics in place and take a long-term view in terms of, as you then pick up the performance of the economy, how are you applying those tax revenues? And I think there will be another window of opportunity for value addition in another set of critical minerals. That's, I think, we've got to look forward to, but use this opportunity to put the basics in place.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Doug. Great. We've got one question here.
Yeah, I was just following up on that point. I think that the big opportunity, I think, for downstream processing is to link it with the energy transition, right? So I think if the downstream processing can be done where there's green energy already available, like a hydropower system, like that the Canadians have in the aluminium sector, or abundant access to solar power and other sources. I think if that's where the coordination is, because that may not be in your country, but it might be several countries away, but that's the logical place to be doing some downstream processing. So I think, again, taking a more holistic view of how that's done across Africa, leverage the natural advantages in certain parts, I think is a great opportunity for Africa, for sure.
I mean, the Inga project is one where many people have lived and died without having seen that project. And I think that's one area where Africa actually has, or at least even if it's sub-Saharan Africa, has a huge opportunity where it could actually attract as much of the industrial activity as it needs to be, if not more than what it can handle, if it were to increase, the level of renewable from hydro. Currently, with the Southern African power pool, a lot of that is South Africa, which is coal-based. But with a lot of manufacturing needing to be low carbon in its content, I think having a huge base of low carbon energy will provide that attraction of investing not only in mining, but I think also in downstream, because it's now investing in clean manufacturing.
Yeah, Malawi and Mozambique are predominantly hydropower. So, that's one big advantage of us also working in Malawi, doing that downstream processing because of the hydropower process.
Great, thank you. Great question, comment. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's after 2 o'clock, and I think